In 1894, a ship captain offered the city elders of Oshawa $6,000 to give him the right to lay a railway track down the center of Main Street and 5 miles onward to the lake. The elders thought they'd saved themselves a bundle for the costs of acquisition of the right-of-way. But from the size of the celebration, when the tracks were finally removed in 1963, it is obvious that the citizens who had to endure their daily inconvenience considered them an abomination. Attempts to remove the rails from the main Simcoe Street had continued for more than 20 years. Oshawa became famous across Canada as the only town with a railroad down the middle of its principal thoroughfare. It was the only town, they said, where you could take the train from the railroad station to your downtown hotel. If you look behind the locomotive in the opening scenes, you will see one corner of the giant General Motors assembly plant that now produces automobiles for both Canada and the USA. When the railroad started, it had a much more diverse set of customers, like the roots of the tree. Sidings twisted away to plants that made roofing, carriages, and perhaps the forerunner of GM, a foundry, stamp mill, flour mill, and a piano works. Many of those sidings had disappeared by the time this tape was made. In 1949, the railroad was operating passenger service each way at approximately 20-minute intervals over the 5-mile line. The 6 electric railways described in this tape were located in the province of Ontario. Although only one was still carrying passengers on a scheduled basis when this tape was made, most had published timetables within the preceding 6 years. Each was founded with the goal of connecting industry in the central part of the province with commercial ports on either Lakes Erie or Ontario. As time went by, the connections that these electric railways made with the 2 great transcontinental main lines, the Canadian Pacific and the Canadian National, plus subsidiaries of the New York Central, the Wabash, and the Chesapeake and Ohio, became more important than any connection with the lake ports. Eventually, most of them became partially owned or controlled subsidiaries of either the Canadian Pacific or the Canadian National. Those lacking these guaranteed connections and often financing not available through normal channels folded into memory at a much earlier date. It's interesting to note, however, that water connections remained important to some into the 1950s. The Niagara, St. Catharines, and Toronto didn't get within 100 miles of Toronto by land, but the railroad had a fleet of passenger ferries that connected Toronto 3 times daily with St. Catharines on the opposite side of the lake. Often these railways were the stepchildren of electric generating or distributing enterprises. As the years went by, both the CPR and the CNR saw the advantage of keeping their feet in the front door of their originating shippers and acquired working control of many of these electric interurbans. In the beginning, it was often the power generating or distributing companies that initiated the building of electric railways. Note the logo here, however. Cornwall Street Railway Light and Power Company. In the minds of the founders, transportation seemed to outweigh illumination in importance. In the farthest left-hand corner of the picture, you can just catch a glimpse of the St. Lawrence River. The London and Port Stanley stretched 21 miles south from London to Port Stanley on Lake Erie. In 1949, it scheduled 15 daily trains from the beach, that's just 2 miles east of Port Stanley, to London. 4 round trips a day were scheduled between London and the New York Central Depot in St. Thomas to connect with the New York Central trains passing through Ontario between Buffalo and Detroit. All 4 were named trains between either New York or Boston and Chicago. The North Shore, the Empire State Express, the Wolverine, and so forth. Ticket agents on the CPR, the CNR, or the New York Central could write coupons from St. Thomas to any station on the London and Port Stanley. This looks like it might be an exotic form of mixed train. Actually, it's a London and Port Stanley passenger car being used as a freight motor, Locomotive 12. In 1960, the Grand River Railway was still operating 3 freights a day over their 15-mile U-shaped Waterloo division from Galt to Waterloo. They had 10 locomotives, and 222 was the oldest on the system and the only box cab. All the others were steeple cabs. When they couldn't obtain diesels short enough to operate on some of the industrial sidings, they built their own 70-ton steeple cab in the Preston shops. In 1949, they offered hourly passenger service from Galt to Preston and Kitchener. The first train left at 5 minutes to 5 in the morning and the last 20 minutes to 1 in the morning. The tracks connected with the CPR at Galt and with the CNR also at Galt and 5 more points. Both the Grand River and the Lake Erie and Northern shared the same officers. Most of them were located in Montreal at Canadian Pacific headquarters. If you look closely, you'll see Canadian Pacific cabooses bobbing along behind many of the trains in this segment. The Lake Erie and Northern had one freight train a day each way between Simcoe and Brantford, and two a day between Brantford and Galt. In 1949, most days of the week saw 10 passenger trains a day each way over the entire 51 miles between Port Dover and Galt. At Galt, they made connection with the Grand River Railway for service to Preston and Kitchener. Promotional literature for both railroads claimed that they served the heart of industrial Canada. The Niagara, St. Catharines, and Toronto, or NS&T as it was often called, was the only interurban in Canada which connected the shores of both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. It was the only interurban which owned real steamboats and operated a waterborne shipping and passenger service. It owned an amusement park at Port Dalhousie, which was served by steamboats from Toronto and trolleys which operated within Canada and also from the United States. By virtue of its right to use a bridge across the Niagara Gorge and a mile or two of track in the city of Niagara Falls, New York, it could call itself the only international interurban in the Dominion of Canada. It had both freight and passenger service up until 1958, and the passenger service included both old-style street-running trolley cars and haughty, groaning interurbans. It had multiple-unit passenger cars of huge proportions. Some called it an eclectic, hodgepodge is probably a more honest term, collection of bits and pieces of rolling stock acquired from far and wide. Some of them were donated by its foster parent, the Canadian National, from other interurbans which the CN had acquired. If the need arose, they built passenger cars in their own shops. They even built passenger cars for other roads and, at the same time, acquired second-hand equipment for themselves. Passenger cars ran on an hourly schedule between Thorold and Port Colborne. They connected not only with the steam trains on the main line of the Canadian National running between Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara Falls, but with the hourly interurbans which ran from St. Catharines to Niagara via Thorold. The Niagara interurbans made a sharp left turn in Thorold and continued east to the Falls. In 1943, through service from Toronto to Niagara Falls by boat to Port Dalhousie and continuing by connecting interurban to the Falls took less than an hour more than the through train. The boat, of course, ran only during summer months. Under the pressure of a huge dam of ice which built up during the severe winter of 1938, the bridge which carried the tracks across the gorge at the Falls crumbled into the river. But the tracks to the Falls had already been abandoned. All passenger service had ended in March of 1959. The railroad continued to provide complete freight car handling services at their 3 interchanges, using a variety of electric freight locomotives. In 1960, the catenary came down, and freight continued to move, but by diesel power. Until that time, the Niagara, St. Catharines, and Toronto was often called the last real full-service electric interurban in North America.